Dr. Bernet is a professor emeritus at Vanderbilt University School of Medicine in Tennessee. He's board certified in general psychology, child psychiatry, forensic psychiatry, and he's a graduate of Harvard Medical School, as well as a summa cum laude grad from Holy Cross College up in Worcester, Massachusetts. He was one of the editors of a 2013 book called Parental, Alienation, the Handbook for Mental Health and Legal Professionals.
So as was pointed out, my topic is just one little niche in the broad field of family law. And I'm going to give you an overview of parental alienation, and I also am going to make some specific policy recommendations. What does parental alienation look like? This is the only thing I would like to read through with you to make sure that we're all on the same page, since people do have slightly different definitions of alienation. Let's read through this together. A child, usually one whose parents are engaged in a high conflict separation or divorce, the child allies himself strongly with one parent, and that's the preferred parent, and rejects a relationship with the other parent, which is the alienated parent, without legitimate justification. So just the main points here is that this usually takes place in a divorce situation, and that secondly, it's without legitimate justification, because if a child wants to reject a parent and there's a good reason, that's something else. That makes sense. What we're talking about is the child rejects a parent and there really isn't a good reason, and frequently the child is put up to it or indoctrinated by the preferred parent to do that. So some people like these diagrams. You know, family therapy people like these diagrams, so we have our diagram. This little yellow squiggle here is what we would call the parental alienation. In other words, parental alienation is the child's rejection of the alienated parent. And this big red arrow over here is what's causing the parental alienation. So this is what we would call the alienating behaviors. In other words, there's conflict between the parents. One parent, whom we call the alienating parent, indoctrinates the child to reject the other parent. And this we consider very bad parenting. In fact, if this is done, if alienating behaviors are done incessantly, we consider that child abuse. And that's an important consideration when you talk about what to do about severe parental alienation. So in terms of how do you diagnose this or how do you identify it, I think the best way to go down these 5 components. And I'm going to go through them one at a time, and the point I'm trying to make by going through them is to get the idea across that there's some science to this, that you can identify parental alienation systematically. And if people have training, if mental health people have training, or even legal people or judges have training in what the 5 components are, you can, with a high degree of reliability, identify this condition. So the first component, I'm going to walk through each of these. The first one is that the child actually does refuse to go visit the other parent. Or even if the child goes and visits, the child refuses to have a relationship with that parent. And in other words, the child is manifesting contact refusal, or sometimes it's called the refuse-resist dynamic. And we use this particular factor to rate the severity of the parental alienation, and we call it mild, moderate, and severe. And we have very simple, my group that I work with, we have very simple operational definitions of mild, moderate, severe. Listen to this. Mild is the child says, I don't want to go see the other parent, but I hate him or her, I don't want to go see him, but the child goes and does fine. In other words, the resistance is superficial and transitory. Moderate is the child says, I don't want to go see the other parent, I hate him or her, but the child goes but doesn't interact. The child is oppositional, stays in his room, refuses to have meals, and basically avoids a relationship even though the child is physically in the house of the other parent. Severe is the child says, I don't want to see the other parent, I hate him or her, and I never want to see him again or her, and the child doesn't go at all. So in severe cases, the child has not had parenting time with the rejected parent for months or years. In severe cases, they end up in court and they haven't seen the other parent for 2 or 3 years. It's just amazing that these cases drift for that long a time. And you know, you can imagine what has happened to the relationship between the child and the rejected parent. If you don't see the person for 2 years, I mean, you can imagine what the child thinks and the misconceptions he has and so on. So anyway, that's the first factor. The child actually does avoid the other parent. The second factor is that they previously had a good relationship. In other words, if the child is 10 and he hasn't seen his dad for the last 2 years, you have to be able to show that in the past they did have a good relationship. And it's usually fairly easy to do this because nowadays everybody has videos and everybody has pictures and on their camera from years ago or in scrapbooks. And you can actually go back and find pictures of what a good time they had when they went to Disney World a few years ago. And children in the past have sent Mother's Day cards and Father's Day cards in which they say, oh, Mommy, you're the best mommy I ever had, or the best mommy in the world. And so you can document that in the past they did have a good relationship. So I'm telling you these 5 factors. This is how you diagnose this condition. The third factor is there is not a history of abuse or neglect, because it makes sense if the father had been abusive to the child in the past or extremely bad parenting. It's understandable that the child doesn't want to go see daddy. So that's not what we're talking about. If there's a good reason to not go see daddy, we're not talking about parental alienation, and we're talking about something different. And nowadays, the terms of art that are used in the literature almost everywhere, and usually in legal settings, is the distinction between alienation and estrangement. We've been talking about alienation. Alienation is when the child doesn't want to go see the other parent, and there's not a good reason. The child has simply made up in his mind that there's a reason. We use estrangement to mean the child doesn't want to go see the other parent, and there is a good reason. That daddy was abusive, or mother was a horrible mother, or whatever. So people pretty much nowadays, and I notice in court that the judges catch on to this, and everybody nowadays seems to use these terms in this way. I say that because this is not actually the strict definition, the dictionary definition, which says these two things are the same. But we make that distinction in this kind of situation. So that was the third factor, is there's no history of abuse. The fourth factor is the presence of alienating behaviors. You remember I showed you that diagram and there's a big red arrow? Those are the alienating acts or behaviors of the alienating parent. This has been studied in research, and there are currently a list of 17. I'm sure there are other things people might do, but these 17 have been studied and documented when you survey parents and you try to count them up. Some of these are, I'm not going to go through the whole list of 17 items, but they're very basic. For instance, on this first page, the preferred parent constantly denigrates or criticizes the other parent in front of the child. Or secondly, the preferred parent limits the parenting time. You know, the dad comes to pick up the child, and it's his time on Saturday morning to pick up the child, and the child isn't there. Or the mom comes out and says, you can't have him today because he has a cold, or whatever. There are many, many ways to limit the child's time with the other parent. Then there are some others. We're not going to go through the whole list. This thing called forcing the child to choose. I'll show you how you do that. It's Saturday morning, it's time for Johnny to go see mom because it's her parenting time, and dad says, honey, it's up to you. If you want to go see mom, you can do that, or if you want to stay here and bake cookies with me, you can do that. In other words, you're not supposed to do that. You're not supposed to let the child choose, but the grown-ups are supposed to be in charge. But this is very common, and that you let the child, and the parents say, oh, he's old enough, he's 9, he should be able to decide whether he wants to be here or there, and this is very common. Another one that's really important of this list of 18 is making the other parent seem dangerous. Maybe it was on the previous one. Okay, it was on the previous one. But that's a really common thing, that the parent won't say to the child, I want you to know that your dad's dangerous. They do it in a much more roundabout way. For instance, they say, I mean, real life story, that they say, honey, when you go see dad this weekend, if he does anything that you don't like or that makes you scared, call 911. And they'll help you out. They'll come. And so obviously, I mean, there's an obvious message to that dad is dangerous. And so anyway, there's a list of 17 alienating behaviors. And so if you have a case like this, and you're trying to say, is parental alienation present, you have to look at these factors. Is the 1, 2, 3, 4 is the alienating behaviors. You have to identify them. You have to locate them. And if you go to court, you have to be able to show them. You can't just make up the idea that somebody's causing this to happen. You have to find the data. So I said there were 5 factors. The 5th one is that there's a series of symptoms. Now this is really interesting because this is kind of how the whole thing started in 1985 when parental alienation was first identified, at least with those words, with that name. That people identified 8 interesting, specific symptoms that these children have that ordinarily do not occur in all the other children whose parents are divorced. And I am going to run through these. First of all, there's the campaign of denigration. That means that the child is constantly complaining about the other parent. Frivolous reasons. They make up really trivial reasons. Dad makes me eat broccoli, so I never want to see him again. Lack of ambivalence is really interesting. It's one I've studied. Lack of ambivalence means that the child says one parent is totally, totally good, and the other parent is totally, totally evil. To an extreme degree. And you can elicit this if you do an evaluation, if you do a mental health evaluation, you can elicit this from the child through certain ways you ask questions. And that's not normal. Normal children don't have that opinion about their parents. Even children who are abused don't have that opinion about their parents. Children who are abused still have kind of a mixture of feelings. I don't like it when dad drinks, but I want to go home and see dad because I haven't seen him for a long time. That's an abused child. Children who are alienated, their mind has flipped so that they go through this and they make one parent totally good and the other one totally evil. And you can identify that. My point is that this is not a mystery how to diagnose this condition. There are hard data that help you identify in a systematic way. There's some other criteria. Maybe one of the more obvious ones is borrowed scenarios. That's where the one parent comes in and has certain complaints about the other parent, and then the child comes in and has the same complaints. Sometimes the complaint are things that happened before the child was born. You know, there was a time that daddy drove recklessly on the interstate and he almost had an accident, and it was scary. And the child says that and recites that, and you say, well, tell me about that. And the child says, well, mommy told me that happened, you know, even before I was born. So anyway, I mentioned these 8 symptoms. If you ever get into this, you have to study these 8 symptoms and really understand them. But I'm just telling you right now that there are 17 behaviors of the alienating parent that have been studied through research. There are the 8 symptoms of the child that have been studied through research. And all these fold into these 5 factors. So what are these children like? It's mentally, what goes on in their mind is this sequence. That first of all, they make false statements to the evaluator or to the attorney or to the judge. They recite what they've been told and make false statements. If you make false statements enough, you start to believe those things, and you have false beliefs. If you have false beliefs persistently, you have false memories. You start to remember things that never really happened. And as a result, these children sometimes are very convincing because what they remember is daddy did this and this and this, and those things never happened. But they're convincing because they think that they actually happened, which is one of the essence of false memories. So what do we do about this? Let's talk quickly about if you identify it. Now, I already told you there's mild, moderate, and severe. So what you do about it depends. on whether your case is mild, moderate, or severe. Mild, the child says, I don't want to go, but he goes anyway, and he does okay. The simple intervention there is for somebody to tell the parents to shape up. That the case has not progressed far enough that it's really a serious situation. But if a judge senses that this is happening, the judge can clearly tell the parents to cut out whatever they're doing in terms of bad-mouthing the other parent or limiting access or whatever they're doing. So judges can do this, attorneys can do this, therapists can do it, psychologists and social workers. So that's simple. In simple cases, usually if you strongly admonish the parent, it helps. More complicated, oops, let me go back. More complicated cases, the moderate ones, is the child goes on the visit but is very negative. Usually, some comprehensive counseling program is helpful. Not so much for the child, the counseling is for the parents. And I don't even use the word counseling, I use the word coaching. That if one of the parents is indoctrinating the child, if the dad is doing the indoctrinating, dad needs a coach to tell him the next time it's time to go visit, see mom, do this, don't do this. In other words, it's not the kind of counseling where you say, tell me your feelings and let's think about it. This is the kind of coaching where you tell the mom and dad what they should be doing. And the receiving parent gets coached too. You know, your child seems uncomfortable in your house. Let's see, what can you do to make it easier for the child to come and have a good time with you? So this frequently works in moderate cases of parental alienation. The really tough cases are the severe cases, where the child doesn't go at all and hasn't been there for 2-3 years. We consider this child abuse. We feel that if one parent has indoctrinated and brainwashed the child to totally fear the other parent, that is child psychological abuse. And we think the child should be removed from that household. It's very simple. And I've said this in court a number of times now. Everybody seems to agree. I mean, the judges seem to agree. Yeah, that's child abuse. I'm in Tennessee, and we actually have court cases in Tennessee where the appellate court has said that alienating the child from the other parent is a form of child psychological abuse. Now, sometimes, so the question is, where should the child go? Sometimes they just go to the other parent. And sometimes that works out fine. Sometimes they need to go to a neutral place. I had a child once go to an aunt and uncle's house for a while. Sometimes they go to a boarding school to get away from both parents. Sometimes they need an intervention to help get through the transition. In other words, if Johnny hasn't been with mom for a year and now suddenly mom has become the custodial parent, Johnny might need a transition intervention that will help him adjust to being in this new home. And usually these interventions work really well. Because underneath, the child still has an attachment with that parent, even though they haven't seen that parent for a year. So these are some interventions. I want to prove to you in 5 minutes that parental alienation should be accepted in legal settings. Are you familiar with the Daubert rule? And I think it's called the Porter criteria here in Connecticut. If you go testify about this, sometimes you have to prove that your topic is scientific. And I'm going to show to you simply 3 or 4 reasons why it's easy to prove this. And I say this because there are a lot of skeptics who say it's not scientific. There are a lot of people who say this should never be brought up in court because there's no science to it. There are deniers, parental alienation deniers. And I want to show you in a simple way that you can use it in court. So the first criterion that frequently is used in court is the thing recognized by the professional community? Is parental alienation recognized by psychologists and psychiatrists and social workers? And the answer is yes. I'm not going to give you all the evidence, but these are organizations that have either directly or indirectly recognized the concept of parental alienation. The one I'm most involved with is the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, and there's a whole parameter on divorce, and it explicitly talks about parental alienation, and these other organizations have similar documents. So that's a criterion that's used in court. It's easy to prove that it's recognized in the relevant community. The second one is it's in books. These are authoritative textbooks that are published regarding either psychiatry or psychology or forensic psychiatry. And parental alienation is in these books. The Encyclopedia of Forensic Science, the Encyclopedia of Clinical Psychology, the CTP is called the Comprehensive Textbook of Psychiatry. It's sort of the Bible for psychiatry in this country. And it's now, I think, in the 10th edition. And parental alienation is discussed in these books. So it's easy to prove that it's an accepted concept in the world of psychology and psychiatry and social work. So the other thing is, has it been published in peer-reviewed journals? So my friends and I have kept track of this, and we've created a database of publications about this. And I like this because it's all these different countries. We found hundreds of articles in 38 countries, which is really interesting because the phenomenon, in other words, what I'm describing here, qualitative research. Qualitative means that the concept has been described by different people in different countries. People have had case reports, it's described. And it's just amazing that the descriptions from Argentina, or from Germany, or from Japan, or from Malta, you know, are similar. It's obvious that we're talking about a real phenomenon, that it occurs in a very similar manner in different cultures. So I'm using this to illustrate the mountain of qualitative research. Another example of qualitative research is this wonderful book. This is a classic book that's known as the Clower and Rivlin book. Is that 5 minutes? Okay. And this is research that was actually sponsored by the American Bar Association. There have been other people who have said that the quantitative research helps to prove those 17 behaviors and the 8 symptoms. This is some research that I did with this professor who's from the University of Connecticut. His name is Ronald Rohner. He developed a wonderful test a number of years ago, and then he and I used it, and we were able to prove that alienated children behave differently from all the other groups of children. If you send me a note, I'll send you the reprint, and you can read about it. I do want to spend a minute or so talking about what we would recommend for public policy. First of all, prevention. This thing is preventable if you start early, if you catch it when it's still mild. And so there are a number of different programs for children or divorcing parents and so on that this would be preventable. Secondly, education. We need to be systematic and aggressive in educating mental health professionals, law students, young lawyers, continuing education for lawyers, and judges. You know, judges go to college out in Nevada. There's a school for judges there every year. And most states have training for judges. This topic needs to be included in educational programs for judges so that they can keep current and know what's going on. Child protection needs to be aware of this because not in mild cases, but severe cases, we consider child psychological abuse. And child protection people should be able to identify it as child psychological abuse. A couple of other public policy suggestions for the legal community. You know, I think judges should be encouraged to pay attention and recognize this. And then once they recognize it, they'll have to figure out what to do about it. There's another problem in family court where cases go from one judge to another, and that creates a lot of discontinuity, and it would be a big help if they stuck with the same judge. I think there are legislative initiatives that could be accomplished, and one of those is this whole idea of shared parenting. I think that if shared parenting were adopted as the default position in the beginning, in the early stage of separation or divorce, that it would reduce the opportunity for parental alienation to happen. And also, and I know there are a lot of people who go that way. And I think in legislation, when you talk about, well, what are the criteria for a custody issue, custody dispute, I think that parental alienation should be included on that list of 15 or 16 criteria that courts are supposed to pay attention to. So I appreciate very much your attentiveness and